Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and today I'll be ranking the Paper Mario 64 chapters from worst to best. This game was a huge part of my childhood, and I must have played it through like 10 times or so at this point. Love the other Paper Mario games as I do. This is the only one that I would say doesn't have any overtly bad chapters, or at least ones I dread. The worst chapter in 64 is better than like half of Thousand Year Door's chapters in my opinion. That said, there is still a definite hierarchy among 64's chapter quality. Let's get into it. Fairly unsurprisingly, I found Chapter 1 to be the worst overall. I don't think it's really all that bad, but it just suffers from being in the opening segment of the game. It's the classic field area most Mario games have, and this one has little to make it stand out from the others. I'll get more into that later, but first, the good. The enemies consist of classic Mario foes such as Goombas, Koopas, and Bob-ombs. While simple, they all work in distinctly different ways, which makes fights interesting. I never find myself dreading an encounter with any of them in particular. As well as that, I think the layout of the chapter is quite nice. The field portion, though dull, doesn't overstay its welcome and is fairly brief before switching over to the Koopa Bros Fortress section. This part feels a little drawn out, but not gratuitously so. And of course the best part about the chapter, the Koopa Bros themselves. For their early appearance, they are surprisingly well executed, I think. They're the closest the game ever gets to having genuine characters for the bosses, along with Bowser, Junior Troopa, and Tubba Blubba. They're more or less what the game wants to portray them as. Cool. Their theme is one of the catchiest in the game, and the jazzy tune suits them well. Unfortunately, the praise ends there. As I said earlier, the best way to describe this chapter aesthetically is boring. The field is a run-of-the-mill green pathway that in most games would be like a connecting hallway or something to a cooler area. And in a way it is that here too, connecting Toad Town to the Koopa Bros Fortress. Sadly, the fortress is not much more interesting. It's got a consistent drab gray color scheme that isn't really bad, but has little in the way of garnish or detail. This all adds up to a pitiful score in the creativity department. Nothing in it feels very original beyond the Koopa Bros. The music is pretty mediocre as well. Beyond the very recognizable Koopa Bros theme, there aren't any masterpieces coming out of this chapter. It's fairly inoffensive, but its overdone, trite content leaves plenty of room for the other chapters to edge it out. I'm not sure what the community consensus is on Chapter 8, but I think it's usually placed on the lower side compared to the others. I suppose I agree. I have lots of gripes with this chapter, but couldn't bring myself to put it below Chapter 1 since this is unarguably the more engaging of the two. Starting off my list of grievances is the enemy design. I gave it the worst marks in the game for that category, and I think it has that honor pretty clearly. The high defense on most enemies makes using any partner other than Watt in combat an obvious misstep, and makes Bow, my personal favorite partner, borderline useless. I dislike having to play in a rigid way, and this chapter certainly enforces that. They also have incredibly high damage output, and coming into this chapter without much healing is suicide. I get that it's the final chapter, but I think it can be overkill, especially if you're someone who likes to funnel points into BP and FP more than health like I do. As well as that, I ranked it at the bottom for creativity too for a few reasons, the abysmal layout being part of that. It drags a lot, and you can sense the design team was sort of lowballing it with ideas for room sections. While there are a few cool bits like the water puzzle, it mainly just feels like a very divided series of lazy puzzles, where the developers were thinking something like, alright, we need to pad this out more, add this gimmick here and make a few rooms worth of it. For example, the lava flow section early on, or the dark cave section in the middle. The horrible pacing of the chapter is at least rewarded with a good final boss fight, although I admit I'm still not a fan of how they brought Junior Troopa back for yet another fight with him earlier before that. I don't dislike him at all, but I would much rather have had a rematch with the Koopa Bros, and the fake out still leaves me a little disappointed every time. There are a few other pluses too. The design is pretty neat in some parts. I personally consider Starhaven to be part of Chapter 8, and while short, I think it's a very interesting area, and it was neat finally seeing what's been referenced so much throughout the game. I also think some sections of Bowser's castle look neat, like that first room with all the chains and lava below. Sadly, the rest of the chapter is pretty samey. Lastly, the music. This is its saving grace. It has by far the most solid compositions in the game overall. The final boss theme is amazing, and I dig the castle theme a lot too. The Koopa Bros theme is technically Chapter 1's turf, but it does make a brief comeback here, which was nice. Unfortunately, music alone does not a good chapter make, relegating the game's climax to the 7th place spot on my list. This is probably my most controversial pick here. I don't like Chapter 4 all that much. This is less due to an objective fault than personal preference, but I just like the other chapters more. As it stands, it's a very creative area that surprised me my first time playing. I don't think I can recall ever seeing an area with this theme in another game, so props to Nintendo on that front. They pull it off well too. It's very detailed and looks the part just as it was meant to. The low score in aesthetics is simply because I don't think it looks that cool. I also think the music is pretty fitting and serves its purpose alright, but once again, I just don't care for it. It's not the kind of thing I'd listen to outside of the game, really. The layout inside the toy box itself is pretty average, but the slight backtracking knocks it down a bit. It could have been much worse though, and as is, it's pretty minor. It's probably the shortest chapter in the game if you know what you're doing, especially if you know the code for the boxes at the green station. Enemy design was hard to grade. I like the variation it has and how unique each Shy Guy variant is, but the stunlock potential the Groove Guys have is incredibly frustrating. Blocking their dizzying attack is something no one I've ever met can do consistently, and it essentially disables Mario for the entire fight if you fail to guard against it. One annoying attack isn't enough to push it down that far though, so I ended up giving it a respectable 3rd place in that category. General Guy as a boss is fairly uninteresting. He's more of an enemy gauntlet than anything else, and even once he joins the fray, he's pretty easy. All said and done, this chapter isn't bad, but it just doesn't appeal to me as much as any of the others above this spot. I'm just as surprised as I assume you guys are to see Chapter 6 this high up. When I was first thinking my ranking through, I had this at the absolute bottom. But playing the game again to get gameplay, I realized I actually sorta enjoyed my time in Flower Fields. My prior distaste for it came mainly out of getting lost or not knowing what to do, which I imagine is common enough. It's not that clear what you're supposed to do, and the layout is prone to enough backtracking as is, so I can see where it'd be a bit much for people if they took too many wrong turns. It's also very difficult to avoid enemy encounters due to the small corridor-styled rooms, which is somewhat aggravating if you're just trying to quickly make your way through. This chapter honestly doesn't have that many problems beyond the layout in my opinion, but it's just worse than the others at most things. The music is alright with some good tracks like Huff and Puff's theme in the Sun Tower. Creatively it is a nice new take on the field idea, although at its core that's still what it is. It has some nice variation with the area design, with neat rooms like the Sun Tower and Cloudy Climb. As I said, they just get beat out by the others ever so slightly. The enemy design is the only way I'd say this chapter shines. Not only are the enemies fair, but they're unique. The bees have lower health but high damage output, making them a priority. The Rough Puffs fill sort of a normal role as air enemies, and the Monty Moles are the ground troops. The Crazy Daisies, while annoying, are a series staple at this point and are more annoying in a laughable way than a truly irritating way, if that makes any sense. I'm curious what you guys have to say on this chapter since I know it's pretty widely disliked though. This was a weird one to place. It didn't score particularly well in the rankings, but I just like it for some reason. Enough to get it in the upper half of the list. One thing I think it did well was variation. There's a hefty spread of environments, from the jungle, deep jungle, and volcano to the Yoshi village and the beach. You even arrive in a pretty unique way, getting a ride from a friendly whale. I thought all these areas were pretty neat, although I may or may not be biased by love for Yoshis. Either way, despite not having the most creative locale, it's well crafted and I always enjoy looking at it. The main things that hold it back are the layout and the enemy design. The layout would have been decent if not for some parts in the jungle and volcano. The Yoshi Kid hide-and-seek sequence, while far less annoying than I recalled it being, was still marred by obnoxious enemy placement. You have to traverse these thin logs that make encounters almost unavoidable, which ended up leading to one of my 3 deaths in my recent playthrough. Enemy encounters are fine, but I much prefer when they're avoidable, and this is not one of those cases. As well as that, the volcano has some super slowly moving platforms that suck to wait for. There's also a part of the chapter that temporarily locks you from backtracking, which forced me to miss a super block I forgot about until later on. It wasn't the end of the world, but it made me backtrack into the volcano after beating Chapter 5, which was a bother. The enemies aren't that awful, although they do tend to get in loops of summoning reinforcements a lot, which is very tiresome when it happens. I think I had one battle that lasted like over 5 minutes because that kept happening. Otherwise, fairly balanced, so I didn't dock it a ton there. Lastly, the music is solid. I dig Raphael the Raven's theme, and the Yoshi Village theme is catchy, at least the slower initial one. No major headbangers, however, so I gave it a respectable middle of the pack rating. With 5 out of the way, now we're getting to the good stuff. This was my favorite chapter as a kid, and while I've changed my mind since, it still holds up excellently. Bo is my favorite partner, as I said earlier, so getting her is nice. As a matter of fact, I love the Boo Mansion area as a whole. No combat, just puzzles, but not the kind that are annoying on replays. It's kind of a nice change of pace from Forever Forest, which is also a cool area. I know I gave props to Chapter 5 for this earlier, but I think 3 100% takes the cake for the most varied area design. You go from haunted woods to the Boo Mansion to a desert-like area to a unique-looking castle to the bottom of a mysterious windmill. The transition from the mansion to Gusty Gulch is absolute whiplash in the best way possible. I don't remember what I expected to be past that gate for my first playthrough, but it certainly wasn't that. The layout is for the most part passable. The only complaint is Tubba Blubba's castle, which is admittedly sort of a large one. I just hate the drones and the amount of enemies in there. I get that they wanted to find a way to use Bo's power, but I feel like there were definitely better ways to make use of it, like how Thousand Year Door handled Vivian's power to get under spikes and stuff. Getting chucked out over and over is a given for most players, and I think most will agree with me when I say it's just frustrating more than anything else. The drones aren't the only annoying thing on Tubba Blubba's castle, though. It's also chock full of spikes, who do a weirdly high amount of damage if you don't block them all perfectly. They often fight in groups of 4, which can make them a hassle to square up against, but even that is less of a nuisance than the true boss of Chapter 3, Hyperclefts. These are the only enemy I did not get gameplay of fighting for this video, since they are so annoying. They are almost invulnerable without use of items or certain badges, and can obliterate your health in one fight. Absolute garbage design, especially for this early in the game. It's mainly because of how avoidable they are that they can slide past Chapter 8's Coup Patrol and Hammer Bro spam. Enough griping though, now for more positives. Tubba Blubba's boss theme, Ghost Gulpin, is the most recognizable track from the game for me, even beating out Huff and Puff's theme in King of Koopas. The other music is quite solid also, and it fits well. The escape from Tubba Blubba's castle is a thrill, and never fails to stress me out a bit, even if I'm cruising by with Speedy Spin. The fight against his heart, while very easy, is a neat one and definitely a unique idea. The way that you get the Star Spirit even, with it being more a trade with both in a standard raid and capture format, was interesting. This chapter has a lot of strange things like that that nudged me towards ranking it so highly in creativity. I also admit I love desert areas, so Gusty Gulch was right up my alley. Speaking of desert areas... Chapter 2 being this good is a feat that greatly impresses me. It's pretty difficult to make the early game of an RPG engaging, let alone stand out as a high point of the game. I genuinely have almost no qualms with this chapter. The enemy design is fairly basic, but that's not really a crime. Bandits stealing your coins was stressful, but it wasn't too hard to fight them off, so I think it's not so bad. Clefts being in Mount Rugged was annoying, but they're pretty easy to slip by, and they give you a good deal of items to deal with them in the event of an encounter, in the way of pout blocks and fire flowers. Looks-wise, this is my favorite chapter hands down. I said it earlier, but I love desert-styled areas, and that's the main idea of this whole chapter. Ruins, an outpost, a barren wasteland, and a hidden oasis. By far being the most vast chapter helps too. The desert's just neat. Consisting of 49 whole rooms, it's cool seeing what's in all of them. Might be something, might be nothing. Neat either way. The music is ranked lower than I expected simply because some of the others are so good, but I like Chapter 2's music too. It's all super fitting, and the Ruins theme especially stands out to me as a well-made track. Deserts aren't the most creative area out there, sure, but the unique layout gets it some grace in that department. I also like how you can skip most of the dry outpost section on repeat playthroughs if you know the right order to get stuff in the shop. I haven't even talked much about Mount Rugged yet either. I think it's a decent area. The whole searching for the letters idea makes you explore it thoroughly, and it's generally enjoyable. Parakarry is cool early game due to his high damage with Shell Shot, so getting him is nice too. Even with all this praise, however, Chapter 2 still gets beat out by one last chapter. This is maybe my favorite chapter in all of Paper Mario in general. I literally cannot think of a single thing about it that bothers me in any meaningful way. The whole penguin murder mystery at the start is less fun on subsequent runs, I guess, but it can go by pretty quick if you know what to do, so I never found it too troublesome. The enemies are all great. The Duple Ghosts are unique idea-wise, and pretty balanced in fights. Other enemies like Gulpits were also made so that they stand out, but not by virtue of being a nuisance like Clefts do. Looks-wise, it's a fantastic chapter too. I love the mirror theme of the Crystal Palace, both aesthetically and for the puzzles it lends itself to. The trail to the top of Shiver Mountain is full of neat rooms too, and accompanied by my favorite ice theme in any video game ever. It's awesome. Not at any time does this chapter feel to drag on out, but it isn't insanely short like Chapter 4 either. The overworld puzzles are well made, and I know I've said it before, but it just looks nice in every way. The Crystal King is a neat boss too, probably the hardest in the game in my opinion. His healing can be annoying, but you should be able to out-damage him if you use your noggin. That's all I have to say really. I just love it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed my countdown. Feel free to drop your own rankings in the comments, or anything else you feel like sharing. We'll have a ranking of Thousand Year Doors chapters out soon, so keep an eye out for that down the road. Deuces.